Imagine a sunny afternoon in Boston. The war is over, and the air is crisp. Suddenly, a sound like a machine gun, the snapping of thousands of steel rivets, pierces the air. Before you can look up, a 25-foot-high wall of dark, viscous liquid, moving at 35 miles per hour, roars down the street. It isn't water, it isn't fire, it's boiling, sticky molasses. It crushes steel, snaps railway tracks like toothpicks, and swallows humans whole. This is the story of the day Sweetest turned into a nightmare. Chapter 1. The Iron Monster of Commercial Street. In 1919, the North End of Boston was a cacophony of immigrant dreams. Italian families crowded the tenements, the smell of garlic and fresh bread wafting through the narrow alleys. But towering over them all, like a rusted god of industry, was the tank. Owned by the United States Industrial Alcohol, USIA Company, the tank stood 50 feet tall and 90 feet wide. It was built in a hurry. As World War I raged, the demand for industrial alcohol, distilled from fermented molasses, was insatiable. It was used for munitions, for smokeless powder, and for the engines of war. Isaac Gonzalez, a low-level clerk for USIA, couldn't sleep. He lived near the tank, and on quiet nights he heard it. It didn't just sit there, it groaned. He had seen the brown syrup weeping from the seams, trickling down the steel plates like blood from 100 small cuts. He warned his superiors. Their response? They painted the tank brown to hide the leaks. Chapter 2. The Pressure of Greed. The weather in mid-January was unseasonably warm. On January 14th, the temperature climbed from near zero to 46 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside the tank, 2.3 million gallons of thick, heavy, and cold molasses began to react to the heat. The physics were simple, but deadly. The fermentation process produced carbon dioxide gas. In a sealed, overfilled container, gas creates pressure. The steel of the tank was too thin, brittle from the cold of the previous week, and now expanding under the warmth of the day. At the Purity Distilling Company, money was the priority. A shipment was coming in, and they needed to empty the tank to make room, but they were late. The pressure was mounting. Every rivet was a tiny bullet waiting to be fired. Chapter 3. 12:40 p.m. The world explodes. It didn't burst like a bubble. It disintegrated like a bomb. At exactly 12:40 p.m. on January 15th, the rivets gave way. The sound was described by survivors as a reeling metallic thunder. The massive steel plates, weighing tons, were hurled hundreds of feet. Then came the wave. 2 million gallons of molasses, weighing approximately 26 million pounds, surged outward. Because molasses is 1.5 times denser than water, it didn't just wet things, it pulverized them. The elevated railway on Commercial Street was lifted off its pilings. Houses were ripped from their foundations. For the people on the street, there was no running. You cannot outrun a 35-mile-per-hour wall of sludge that traps your feet like quicksand the moment it touches you. Chapter 4. The Sticky Graveyard. The aftermath was a scene from Dante's Inferno. The air smelled sickly sweet, cloying and suffocating. Horses were trapped, thrashing in the mire until they exhausted themselves and sank. Men and women were encased in a brown tomb, their lungs filling with syrup. The rescue efforts were a nightmare. Every step a fireman took, he sank to his knees. To pull a victim out, they had to use saws to cut through the thickening confectionery cement. 21 people died, 150 were injured, but the real story began when the molasses dried. Chapter 5. The Trial of the Century. The legal battle that followed lasted 6 years. It was one of the first major class action lawsuits in U.S. history. USIA tried to claim that anarchists had blown up the tank, a common fear in the Red Scare era of 1919. But the truth was found in the metal. Experts proved that the tank was built with a factor of safety of almost 0. It was a monument to corporate negligence. The court's decision changed American engineering forever, leading to the strict building codes and professional licensing we have today. Chapter 6: The Human Cost. Minutes of Terror. Among the chaos of the collapsing North End, individual lives were being decided by inches. Anthony DeStasio was just a young boy walking home from the Michelangelo School for lunch. When the roar began, he didn't even have time to turn around. He felt himself lifted off his feet as if by a giant, invisible hand. The wave of molasses picked him up and carried him, tumbling over and over like a pebble in a surf of dark syrup. He was eventually pinned against a telegraph pole, the sticky mass rising to his chin. He survived only because a gust of wind blew a piece of debris toward him that he could cling to, keeping his head above the thickening liquid until help arrived. Nearby, at the Engine 31 firehouse, the firemen were playing a game of cards. The building didn't just flood, it was sheared off its foundation. The ground floor collapsed, trapping the firemen in a crawl space that was rapidly filling with molasses. One firefighter, George Lay, fought for hours to keep his head above the rising tide, his brothers in arms desperately trying to shovel the muck away from him. Tragically, the weight of the debris and the relentless viscosity of the syrup were too much. He became one of the 21 souls claimed by the tank. Chapter 7: The Brown Snow and the Rescue. The rescue operation was unlike anything the city had ever seen. Because the molasses was so thick, rescuers couldn't swim through it or boat over it. They had to lay down wooden planks to walk, creating a temporary boardwalk over a sea of brown death. The USS Nantucket, a training ship docked nearby, sent its sailors rushing to the scene. They were the first to arrive, finding people unrecognizable, transformed into brown statues by the cooling syrup. As the temperature dropped that evening, the molasses began to harden. What was a rushing river at noon became a thick, gooey trap by sunset. The cleanup was an even greater feat of engineering. Salt water. Firefighters discovered that fresh water did nothing to dissolve the mess, it only made it more slippery. They had to use high-pressure saltwater hoses from the harbor to break down the sugars. The smell of death. The smell was so potent that it induced nausea in the workers. It wasn't the smell of a bakery, it was the smell of fermentation and rot. The tracking. For weeks, every person who walked through the North End carried the disaster with them. Molasses was tracked into streetcars, into the mahogany offices of downtown Boston, and into suburban homes. The entire city literally became sticky. Chapter 8: The Sabotage Theory. As the dust and syrup settled, the United States Industrial Alcohol Company launched a massive PR campaign. They didn't want to admit that their tank was a rusted tin can. Instead, they pointed the finger at the political climate of 1919. This was the year of the Red Scare. Anarchist bombings were happening across the country. USIA claimed that Italian anarchists had planted a bomb at the base of the tank to destroy a symbol of American industrial might. They used the machine gun sounds heard by witnesses, which were actually steel rivets snapping under pressure, as proof of an explosion. The FBI, then the Bureau of Investigation, was called in. The city was on edge. Was this an act of war, or was it corporate greed? The tension in Boston was at a breaking point, and the upcoming legal battle would become a landmark in the history of American justice.